All right, last of all, I want to make a comment about free speech and Victoria's Deputy Chief Health Officer, Annalise Van Diemen. Annalise Van Diemen came under quite a bit of criticism on the 30th of April when she tweeted this. She said, "Sudden arrival of an invader from another land, decimating populations, creating terror, forces the population to make enormous sacrifices and completely change how they live in order to survive COVID-19 or Cook 1770. Now, this, of course, was on the 250th anniversary of the arrival of Captain James Cook to the east coast of Australia, which he mapped, and then I think he took some flora and fauna specimens and he sailed away. And so she's quite wrong about him in particular, but that's all, we'll put that to one side for a second, because the point I want to make is this. As I listened to the debate about this, I just noticed some terribly garbled arguments around free speech. And so people would criticise what she said, and then I heard a radio announcer saying, but she's got the free speech to say it. You'd be upset if someone on your side of the political spectrum, didn't have the free speech, and so on and so on. And so I thought, well, that's a mess, that particular line, because it misunderstands what's going on with free speech. And this is a good case study. What does free speech mean in a context like this? In a nutshell, and this is important, it means this: speech is met with speech. The result of speech is more speech and countervailing speech. So things which are said freely have things said freely in reply. That's what discourse, debate, discussion looks like when you have one voice replied to with another voice. It's such a basic sort of principle, but that's important because it helps us think clearly about this kind of thing. So in the case of Ms. Van Diemen, does debate, criticism, objection, does that amount to a denial of free speech? No, it doesn't. Of course not. That is free speech. That is the very definition of free speech. But let's say the calls for her to be fired. Would that amount to a breach of free speech? Quite possibly it could, actually. And I'll explain why. And I'll explain why it might not as well. But I asked the question, if that's the free speech paradigm, what breaks that paradigm? What destroys it? What breaks it down? And the answer is that it's broken by overreaction. Now, an example that's dear to my heart would, of course, be the Uzi Folau situation, where there was speech. And I remember saying at the time on a TV interview, I said, well, to ruin the guy's career is a crazy overreaction to hearing something that you didn't like to hear. You see, it's that overreaction. It's not met with speech, but it's met with some form of discrimination, which is actually an act like denying employment, denying accommodation, things like this, an act to disadvantage someone because of their opinions and their views. That's discrimination. Speech is not actually discrimination, although there's been a fuzzying and a blurring of the categories there. Speech is speech, and there are some that argue that it can be vilification, but it's not discrimination. And it's that overreaction that's the problem. If someone speaks and they get fired, that's the overreaction. Or I did a piece on Franklin Graham recently, and there's another example. There's a guy who speaks, and he's going to come to the UK and speak, and there's government-owned venues. And what they say is they don't say, well, actually the night afterwards we're going to host somebody who says the opposite and argues with him and puts out their point of view. Or actually we disagree with this man and we're going to put out a media statement and we're going to tell the press, but that's the extent of our opposition to his speech is to speak. No, instead they deny him access to the accommodation for his events and he has to cancel the tour. That's actually discrimination. And this is a really important point to make, because you often get people doing that because they're crying discrimination, but they don't know what they're talking about. What they're crying about is speech, and they are the ones discriminating. It's that overreaction that destroys the free speech paradigm. Now, in relation to Victoria's Deputy Chief Health Officer and what she said, the basic principle in most cases is debate with the lady. Don't overreact either, because I think this is just a separate point. People will start to look at you and think, well, aren't you confident in your beliefs? Don't just say she should be fired. For heaven's sake, say why she's wrong if you believe she's wrong. Or say why she hasn't given the whole story if you think there's more to the story that needs to be considered. And I believe both of those things are probably true. There is more to the story. It's not all one side. There's a balance to be had here, but it's actually quite wrong about Captain James Cook that he was that he did that. He didn't. That's not why he came. Have that argument. Say it. Now, here's the exception that applies in this case, though, which does complicate it. And there are certain very clear exceptions, but it's important that in these exceptions people know exactly what they're signing up for. They know exactly what the expectations on them are in advance. so that they know what that limitation on their, for example, speech is, and it's got to be completely legitimate in light of these very unusual circumstances. What is the circumstance here? She's a public servant. She's a very senior public servant. And it's actually pretty important as a very, very long-standing principle that public servants, especially senior public servants, are not seen to have political biases one way or the other, because it undermines people's confidence in the administration of the duties of the government, and also it makes political bias a feature of their job when it shouldn't be a feature of their job, because it's actually irrelevant to their job and it's got to remain that way. And so actually her saying this is probably the wrong thing to do as a senior public servant. And therefore I think that what happened was probably reasonable, which is that a conversation was had. She said she removed Twitter from her phone, etc. Okay, fine. I don't think it's a sackable offence straight up. But that is the exception that applies here. And sometimes there are very well understood exceptions that she knows apply to her. It's not like she suddenly faces this backlash. She knows full well the Victorian Public Service Code of Conduct, I actually read it, has these principles in it that she should be apolitical. So where does that leave us? Well, hopefully with a better understanding of how a free speech paradigm applies in practice, because there's been so much muddying of the waters on that, and people cry discrimination, vilification, and who knows what else without substance. But secondly, in a bit of a twist, even though I might not agree with Ms. Van Diemen's politics, I'm assuming I don't on the large part, that's okay. I actually think that she should be perfectly right, perfectly okay in her job, perfectly secure. And sure, maybe they have a conversation and say, look, don't do too much of that and draw attention to politics in your role because it's not really what you're here for. Fine, that's okay. But I certainly don't agree that that is, at the moment, a sackable offence. I'm Mark Niles, and that was The Truth of It. Out a great deal by hitting the like button and then hitting subscribe, hitting the bell as well so you get the notifications. It helps us out a really great deal, and you can click here to see more videos.